start, I would like to make a couple of announcements on behalf of Nehru Memorial. On the 2nd of December 2013, that is Dr. Anuradha Kalhan Siddiqui will speak on the possibility of inclusion. 5th December will be Professor Harsh K. Gupta. He is from the National Disaster Authority and he will speak on earthquakes, how to cope with them. 6th December, Friday, will be Dr. Shyam Babu's lecture. He is from the Center for Policy Research and he is also giving a public lecture under the Interrogating Social Justice series. How we fail social justice, the mismatch of constitutional provisions and institutionalism. These are 3 forthcoming lectures. And just a brief announcement about the occasional papers being brought out by NMML. These have really proliferated in the last couple of years, the last year. The most recent to come out are Gita Dharampal 6, Interrogating the Historical Discourse on Caste and Race in India. Interested in buying them. I'm truly happy because I'm coming straight out of a hospital bed into this seminar and I wouldn't have missed it for anything because Kumkum is a long-standing friend and colleague, apart from being an outstanding historian. She is currently teaching at JNU. We are both in the Ancient India unit. She has published very widely. The paper is there for you. But beginning as a feminist historian, she has really branched out into, in fact, mainstreaming women's history and making the study of history more gender and truly academic manner. She has also been involved in NCRT books, textbook writing, which I think has made her arguments extremely sharp and focused, so that she has evolved over the years as a historian who was moved away from feminist histories to broader history, social, economic. And her writing for school children has given her a tremendous ability to communicate with people, and I think that's what I really most admire in her recent presentation. Kumkum has a very, very attractive title. She always had very attractive titles. On the Trail of the Yak Tail, Tangled histories of a symbol of ritual and power. Over to Kumkum.
Thank you very much, both Mahesh and Vijaya. And Vijaya, I realize what an effort you've made to be here today. And thank you very much for that, as well as for what you've just said. I just wanted to begin by mentioning that this is something that will become obvious as I speak, that this is very much work in progress, so I would welcome suggestions and any other ideas that you might have. Also, I will be posing questions rather than providing answers. In terms of what is there on the PowerPoint, all of the good things in the PowerPoint I owe to my friend and colleague Supriya Parma, because when I was trying to put things in, the images just grew and grew and grew, and I couldn't squeeze them back, and she managed to do whatever has been done. She's not here, but I would just like to acknowledge that. One of the visuals has been provided by Bharati Jagannathan. Some of the other visuals are from this article by Asher and Stig called Modern Figural Art Reconsidered. Some others are from Susan Strong's The Art of Sikhism, and some, especially those that deal with the yak, come from Stanley Olson's work, Fossil Ancestry of the Yak and its Cultural Significance and Domestication in Tibet. Now, as you can see, the title has changed between what I had presented, because I realized that there were several trails rather than a single trail. So it has now become On the Trails of the Yak Tail. One of the many challenges of early Indian history is to arrive at an understanding of the ways in which material resources were deployed to constitute symbols. This is a vast and immensely complex field, and my attempt here is simply to focus on the use of animal resources, or specifically the chamara, often translated as the fly whisk, which is a functional description, or the yak tail fan, pointing to its material of origin. I begin with a brief enumeration of the material resources that were meant to be mobilized, reworked and displayed and consumed in rituals such as the Ashwamedha, drawing for that on the Shatapatha Brahmana. This will be followed by a discussion on what is possibly the earliest and certainly the most spectacular representation of the chamara, held by a woman, the Dilalganj Yakshi, as she is popularly known, to trace some of the debates this figure has generated. I next turn to the ways in which animal resources are conceptualized in the Arthashastra, before moving on to a consideration of the representation of the chamara in courtly literature, exemplified for the moment by the Harsha-charita. This will be followed by a brief survey of some of the contexts within which the chamara surfaces in other traditions. And finally, I draw on ethnographies of contemporary Yak pastoralists to raise questions about the significance of the chamara and its users. And one of the questions that I raise is whether it does allow us to visualize the relationship between courtly or Brahmanical worlds and less sedentary populations in more complex ways, beyond the boundaries of dominance and subordination. In opening up these diverse scenarios, I work with a broad understanding of consumption, moving beyond the notion of ingestion which frames the category of vegetarian and non-vegetarian, to suggest that patterns of consumption of other animal products, skin, bone, tail, fur, horns, tusk, teeth, etc., are also significant and may be useful in arriving at a more complex picture. And this is just to point out that this is by no means an original insight. Animal rights activists such as Maneka Gandhi frequently remind us, and this is from her popular column, that there is much more to animals than what we ingest. I'll just come back to this at the end because I bought a little chamara in the local market in Chittarajan Park very recently. So in case I'm not clean after this, you will know why. At another level, we are also faced with the question of understanding the significance assigned to artifacts derived from animals. In this case, the chamara or the Yak Tail fan, in use for possibly more than 2 millennia. It is unlikely that its significance remained constant and unchanging through this period, and the different contexts within which it was and is used. What is intriguing about these contexts is that they are far removed from the world of the first bearers of the yak tail, that is the yaks, both domesticated and wild, and yak pastoralists who provide access to the former. And yet the chamara is almost seamlessly integrated into ritual and political symbolism. How are these meanings forged and sustained? While we may not have the answers, it is possible that opening up these questions may allow us to engage with complexities that tend to get lost in taking for granted assumptions about royalty and sacrality. So we begin with the Ashwamedha, the horse sacrifice, which is perhaps the best known ritual of early India. It is discussed at length in later Vedic texts, exemplified by the Shatapatha Brahmana, perhaps compiled between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC in the mid-Ganga Valley. Before turning to the details of the text, intended for the guidance of ritual specialists engaged in the performance of the sacrifice, we may note in passing some of the other contexts in which the Ashwamedha figures. It is mentioned in a variety of other textual traditions, including both the Sanskrit epics, that is the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and is particularly crucial in the former. Besides, kings from the postmodern period often routinely list the performance of the sacrifice as one of their accomplishments. This is mentioned in their inscriptions. And the sacrifice was commemorated in a spectacular gold coin issued by the Gupta king Samudragupta in the 4th century of the Common Era. Central to creating and publicly proclaiming royal identity, the Ashwamedha was a year-long ritual and involved mobilizing a vast array of resources. Here I will discuss the plant and animal produce as well as other materials that were regarded as essential ingredients. In the case of the first two, we are drawn into an elaborate classificatory system that at once distinguished between the wild and the domesticated and worked out connections between them in complex ways. As we will see, this blurring of taxonomies is worth keeping in mind, as later traditions often locate the yak within the domain of the wild. This strategy is also apparent vis-a-vis other animals and animal produce that have assigned symbolic value. In 1982, a work with which many of us are familiar, Francis Zimmerman's masterly work, which is titled in English as The Jungle and the Aroma of Meats, challenged our understanding of the wild in a variety of ways. And his analysis of the conceptualization of the wild in Sanskrit medical traditions is at once compelling, provocative, and stimulating. One of the ideas that he follows, and one of the traits that he follows, is that of the antelope skin, the Krishnajina. And here I quote what he has to say. He said, "Let us simply note that the object chosen to symbolize the land of sacrifice is precisely the pelt of an animal that is never used as victim, but is on the contrary the very epitome of game. There are many links, little recognized, between hunting and sacrifice. And it is this carefully crafted dovetailing of the domesticated and the wild, amongst other things, that I wish to draw attention to in this section." The Shatabata Brahmana does not provide us a complete list of all the materials required for the ritual, but chooses instead to focus on those that were considered particularly significant or whose use, it was felt, has to be explained. Plant produce, especially prepared from cultivated grain, was routinely offered. Various kinds of cooked grain dishes were prepared for offering throughout the ritual, and in some instances the offering is specifically designated as being rice, in other cases of barley. At the same time, wild plant produce was also imbued with symbolic meaning, not always self-evident. For instance, the rope to tie the sacrificial horse was to be made of dargha grass. The slaughtered horse was laid out on a reed mat, and this was because reeds were supposed to symbolize water, and the horse, like much else, was supposed to have originated from the primeval waters. Moreover, trees from the forest were carefully selected to provide the stakes to which the sacrificial animals were tied. And you have different varieties mentioned. A total of 21 stakes were used, made out of 5 or 6 different kinds of trees. Besides, other animals apart from the horse were laid out on mats made out of twigs of another tree. Without going into all the details of the symbolism involved, which is often discussed, one will note the range of forest produce that would have been required. If cultivated plants constituted routine offerings, ghee was equally, if not more, ubiquitous in such contexts, typically being ladled into the sacrificial fire. There is also mention of the use of milk, and amongst the elaborate sacrificial feasts or dakshina given at the end of the ritual, we find mention of 1,000 cows to be offered to each of the chief sacrificial priests. While the horse was central to the ritual, other animals that were sacrificed included the goat that was tied in front of the horse, regarded as being sacred to Agni, the god of fire. This was one of the set of animals that constituted the paryanga, meant to surround the limbs of the sacrificial horse, and included a ewe placed below the horse, 2 goats for the forelegs, another goat for the navel, 2 more on either side for the flanks, another pair for the thighs, a white goat for the tail, as also a cow and a calf and a dwarfish animal. Each of the animals was imbued with symbolic value. For instance, those on either side of the horse were meant to be white and black, respectively, and were offered to Surya or the sun god and Yama or the god of death. These were visualized as constituting a suit of armor protecting the horse and by extension the yajamana or the sacrificer on either side. This in turn enabled the suitably protected sacrificer or king to perform heroic deeds. Birds were also to be caught for the sacrifice. These included 3 quail-like birds, 3 sparrows and 3 partridges. These, like the wild animals, were to be released rather than sacrificed. The most visible symbol of animal resources was the sacrificial horse, which represented the created god Prajapati as well as the sacrificer. There are discussions on the horse's body and what to do with it, somewhat graphic in some instances. And given our interest in the tail, we may note that there is a hint of priestly speculation on its significance. We learned that the gods or the devas, almost invariably recognized as the primordial sacrificers in mythology, evidently reached heaven by holding onto the horse's tail. Apart from the horse, other animals used in the ritual include an enigmatic creature called the gomriga, literally the cow-like animal, tied along with the horse and the hornless he-goat to the central sacrificial stake. Ekeling, the patient and very careful translator of this huge text, draws attention to several speculations, both ancient and recent, on this intriguing animal. Sanskrit commentarial traditions refer to it as the bovine deer or the nilgai. Based on this, Ekeling attempted to fit it in within existing zoological taxonomies, suggesting that it may have been the bos gabius or the bos frontalis or the bos cabifrons, occasionally regarded as synonymous, found in the eastern districts of Bengal and in Malabar in mountainous areas and often domesticated by hill tribes for meat and milk. This I'm citing from him. Noteworthy about these attributions is the marginality in terms of sacred geography of these regions from the point of view of the later Vedic sacred lands, which, as we have seen, can be correlated with the mid-Ganga valley. In a somewhat desperate attempt to resolve the search for equivalences, Ekeling also suggested that the animal was probably extinct. Our inability to identify the animal satisfactorily becomes all the more frustrating given the function assigned to it in the ritual. One of the anxieties of the ritual specialists related to the disposal of the blood of the sacrificial animal. In the case of the Ashwamedha, this was done through 3 offerings made to Shiva or Rudra, the first 2 of which were meant to protect animals or Pashu from the deity, while the third was meant to protect the Vish or the ordinary people or the community. The first offering was made into the throat of the gomriga, the second on the hoof of the horse, and the third into an iron bowl. The gomriga itself was sacrificed, as is evident from a discussion on how its fat was to be disposed. Apart from the use of plants, animals, and birds, and resources derived from them, metals were also required for the sacrifice. Foremost amongst these was gold, generally referred to as hiranya, which was assigned considerable symbolic value. It was supposed to represent the seed or the semen of the horse, and was thus symbolic of its generative powers, which the sacrificer was expected to appropriate through the performance of the ritual. Therefore, somewhat ironically yet understandably, the slaughtering knife used to sacrifice the horse was made of gold. Gold ornaments, more specifically the nishka, were meant to be worn by the Adhadus, the priest who performed the ritual actions, as well as by the wives of the sacrificer. Besides, gold-covered equipment, including seats and coverings, were to be used. Cups for offering soma were specially made of gold and silver, and gold was also included in the dakshina, as was silver. Metals were implicitly and often explicitly ranked. For instance, the needles used to pierce the animals were made of copper, silver, and gold. This was supposed to lead to the attainment of all 3 worlds. Copper and iron ranked lower in this symbolic universe. Therefore, knives made of these metals, which may have been more effective than the gold equipment used for the horse, were used to slaughter the animals that surrounded the limb of the horse, that is the paryangas. Precious stones were also used, and these include pearls, supposed to be symbolic of the life of man, which was used to decorate the mane and the tail of the horse. Apart from metal and stone artifacts, other processed produce that were used in the ritual include cloth. The text states that 100 pieces of cloth had to be gifted as part of the dakshina. Besides, we find mention of a range of military equipment used by those who were expected to guard the sacrificial horse as he wandered for a year. These included swords, quivers, arrows, and stakes. There is one more issue that needs to be flagged before we move beyond the horse sacrifice, and this is the significance assigned to fanning. We learn that the wives who walk around the sacrificed horse are supposed to fan it, and this happens, according to the commentator, when their garments flutter as they perform the pradakshina, circumambulating the dead animal. This act ensures that they restore the vital airs or prana that departs at the sacrifice. The trail through the Ashwamedha leaves us with some possibilities. First, and somewhat obvious, it is evident that the proclamation of the power of the king involves the mobilization of a range of resources. These would have been obtained from agrarian and pastoral populations, also from craftspersons, including metal workers and weavers, and from forest dwellers. Also, none of the categories we have enumerated were homogeneous. To cite just one instance, goat and sheep pastoralists would have been distinct from cattle pastoralists, as indeed the blacksmith from the goldsmith. Obviously, a whole range of networks of communication is implicit in the details that are laid out. Second, while the tail of the horse carried symbolic value, as did the act of fanning, animal tails being used as fans or whisks were not part of this complicated world of ritual symbolism, nor did they serve to render kingship visible. And third, there is the tantalizing home rigor. I now move on to the second section, which I have titled The Invisible Yak Tail Fan, the Case of the Leaders and Yakshi. I'll just quickly show these three. You're all familiar with these images, so I'll stop with the third one. The Leaders and Yakshi ranks amongst the best-known pieces of early Indian sculpture. The history of its canonization has been traced by scholars such as Richard Davis and Dr. Thakurta. I used these discussions as well as an earlier investigation that attempted to contextualize the Yakshi by Asher and Spink to argue that while the Yakshi has become over the decades one of the most visible symbols of early Indian art, the fan that she holds in her right hand has not attracted the kind of attention that it possibly deserves. Asher and Spink describes the figure in question as the Leaderganj Chaudi bearer. But having done so, they move quickly away to shift the spotlight on questions of chronology. The very first sentence of their article sets the tone. The Leaderganj Chaudi bearer is perhaps the most controversial of all Indian sculptures, with solidly respectable scholars disputing its date by as much as half a millennium. For the Chaudi bearer herself, they note the pine spot and its coat on the eastern outskirts of Patna, the highly polished sandstone surface, the detailing of the ornamentation and the clothing, as well as the strands of hair on the chaudi. But their central focus is to list such attributes only in order to demonstrate continuities with other sculptural representations of female figures, none of which bear the chaudi, and with male figures which may have been chaudi bearers. The arms are dismembered, so we really don't know for sure what they held. There are parallels in terms of the ornaments that adorn these figures, but not in their clothes. Asher and Spink also attempt to locate the Yakshi within a tradition of post-Mauryan art, arguing against the tendency to attribute her to the Mauryan period on account of the superb polish. The authors consider whether the similarities they note arise from the location of the stone sculptures found within 10 kilometers of one another, or whether it is a question of a shared chronology, and decide to privilege the latter possibility, arguing for a Kushana date. From this, they move on to contend that anthropomorphic representations in stone were probably post-Mauryan. This in turn is located within larger iconographic debates about the first anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha and the Jaina Tirthankaras. In all of this, fascinating as it is, we lose sight of the chaudi. If it is indeed a Yak Tail fan, how and why does it appear in the tropical Ganga Valley near present-day Patna, far away from the paths of yak pastoralists? In his absorbing account of the history of the Vedas and Yakshi, Davis takes us beyond narrow art historical concerns with chronology. His description of the statue is at once precise and poetic, and I quote, "When unearthed in 1970 and set upright, the impressive image stood on its pedestal 6 feet 9 inches tall. It was a voluptuous female figure with wide hips and full breasts, leaning forward slightly towards the viewer. One of her arms was missing, the other held a long fly whisk draped over her shoulder. Though the tip of her nose was chipped off, she maintained a serene and slightly enigmatic smile. Her sandstone body was burnished to a lustrous finish." For Davis, the figure's identity as a Yakshi is taken for granted. He implies that the worship of Yakshas and Yakshis were part of fertility cults that were later accommodated within other religious traditions. At the same time, he acknowledges, and I quote, "We cannot know the precise liturgical setting she originally occupied, nor do we know when or how she was dislodged from that spot." Davis also noted how the Chowdi figure is a marker that enables the classification of the figure. D.R. Spooner, the curator of the Patna Museum, drew attention to the Chowdi to argue that the image was that of an attendant rather than a deity, and used this to acquire possession of the image on behalf of the state, removing it from the impromptu arrangements for worship that had been set up. Davis also pointed out how decades later, in 1985, when the Yakshi formed the centerpiece for an international exhibition on sculpture of India, held in Washington, D.C., Pramod Chandra, who prepared the catalogue, observed, and I quote, "As a matter of fact, the fly whisk is a common attribute of this type of divinity, but this fortunately was unknown to the donors." However, as Davis observes, and again I quote, "More likely it was the authoritative presence of 2 British officials backed by a coterie of policemen that proved persuasive to the residents of Biberganj rather than the iconographic niceties of fly whisks." Guha Thakur's narrative takes off from where Davis leaves us, tracing the later history, or as she describes it rather picturesquely, the travels and travails of a Yakshi. She explores the turning point in its history and how it acquired canonical status. Her description of the statue varies only slightly, but significantly, from that of Davis. The sculpture in question is a freestanding right-sized female figure made of burnished sandstone with one arm missing and the other holding a long fly whisk slung over the shoulder. As it stands 6 feet 8 inches on the pedestal, the figure engages the viewer on many counts. The intricate style of the modeling, the lustrous polish on the sandstone body, and not least of all the voluptuous nude anatomy. The fly whisk is slung rather than draped, suggesting a more active stance. The image has lost an inch, perhaps because the pedestal is considered separately. It has become right-side and has lost its enigmatic smile. When the smile reappears, it is from Pramod Chandra's catalogue prepared for the exhibition of Indian art at Washington in 1985. Guha Thakur reads this justifiably as an attempt to stake a claim to the space occupied by that other enigmatic woman, Mona Lisa. At the same time, the voluptuous figure remains center stage. For Guha Thakur, the negotiations around the sensual and the sexual and their uneasy coexistence with the spiritual within nationalist discourse becomes the major focus of investigation. Incidentally, she cites the poet P. Lal, for whom the fly whisk becomes a feather fan. But this poetic license passes without comment. Overall, then, some of the most fascinating accounts of the Biberganj Yakshi take the fly whisk for granted as something that requires little or no explanation. While not as enigmatic as the smile of the Yakshi, it leaves us with a trail that requires far more systematic exploration than can be embarked on at present. I turn now to the third section, which is based on the Arthashastra and the way it refers to material resources. The yak, virtually absent in the Vedic tradition, surfaces almost incidentally in the Arthashastra. If the text can be dated, at least in part, to the Maurya period, this would indicate that by the 3rd century BC, animals and animal produce were being classified for a variety of purposes and using a range of criteria. As in most Shastras, we find a preoccupation with preparing comprehensive lists. While most of these enumerate resources from a mundane perspective, there are occasional glimpses of other concerns as well. One such concern is with symbols of status. This is evident in a list of equipment that a man intending to spy on men of high status was expected to carry. The spy could disguise himself as the bearer of any one of the following: the chhatra or umbrella, dhringara or water vessel, vyajana or fan, paduka or footwear, asana or seat, yana or carriage, and vahana or mount. It is evident that all of these were viewed as constituting the routine accessories of a man of high status. We may also note that the vyajana was not designated as a chamara. It could therefore have been made of other materials as well. There is yet another list of status symbols meant to be offered by the king to rich men so as to induce them to make contributions to the royal treasury. Here the king or his officers are advised to offer such men the chhatra, the veshtana and the vibhushana, that is the umbrella, turban and ornaments, as rewards in return for gold. The fan does not figure in this list. The text also contains other lists, including those of pastoral animals or draja, which include the cow, the buffalo, goat, sheep, donkey, camel, horse, and mule. If we compare this with the list of animals brought into the sacred realm within the Ashwamedha, we note the addition of the buffalo, donkey, camel, and mule. These are not obviously regarded as sacred. What is also interesting is the list of animals designated as forest creatures. These include Pashu and Mriga, both generic terms that could be used to designate animals affiliated to the family of cattle and deer, and the inevitable elephant. All of them are associated with the mana. Another intriguing list is of skins. There are 12 different kinds of skins, differentiated in terms of their place of origin, color, and length. Here we come across the samura, the chinasi, and the samali, all of which are supposed to come from Mandapa. Of these, the first is of 36 angulars, about 26 inches and black, the second is reddish or pale black, and the third is wheat colored. In his note on this, Gandhi mentions commentaries that allocate Mandapa as being in the Himalayas, and mentions that according to K.K. Jaiswal, a Central Asian fur is still known as samura and is still imported into India. Do we have a hint of the chamara in these names? Of skins, that is charmanam, we learn the ones that are soft, smooth, and with thick fur are the best. The text then proceeds to discuss wool and what can be made of it, and 10 different kinds of woolen products are enumerated, not all of which can be identified. These include blankets, protective armor, and horse saddles. There is also mention of waterproof materials, specifically designated as Nepalakam, that is from Nepal. And again, one is tempted to suggest that some of these products may have been obtained from either yak wool or the leather obtained from the yak. There is also a detailed listing of materials to be provided by the Vanapada, literally those in charge of protecting the forest, who provided resources designated as Kukya to the Kukya Dhaksha, translated by Kamble as the Director of Forest Produce. These include 21 named and all possible unnamed trees, 8 named and again unnamed trees, 5 named and unnamed creepers, fibrous plants, plants used for making ropes, leaves of plants, flowers, roots, fruits, etc., 16 named and other unnamed poisons, and then a list that includes all the skins, bone, bile, tendon, eyes, teeth, horns, hooves, and tails of the following: the lizard, the seraka, the leopard, the bear, dolphin, lion, tiger, elephant, buffalo, chamara, shrimara, rhinoceros, bison. This is the gomdigga, according to Tangled, and other animals and birds. Another frequently cited list is that comparing produce from the Uttarakatha and the Dakshinapatha. From the Himavant of the Himalayas, we learn are procured elephants, horses, fragrant substances, ivory, animal skins, silver, and gold. However, Kautilya prefers the southern route, which does not, it is true, provide blankets, skins, and horses, but yields instead conch shells, diamonds, rubies, pearls, and golds. Could some of the blankets and skins have been produced from materials obtained from yaks? Yet, the yak, as indeed many other animals, does not figure centrally amongst those that were subjected to consistent administrative surveillance. Animals that have adjectors or officers assigned to look after them include the cattle, horse, and elephant. The best horses we learn come from regions beyond to the northwest of the subcontinent and beyond. Other horses are dismissed as inferior. The value of these animals in the Arthashastra rests on their military potential, and any symbolic use of the animal for sacrifices is not considered worthy of discussion. The Arthashastra thus provides us with vivid details about animal resources, and while acknowledging the possibility of their symbolic deployment, is far more preoccupied with their utility in more mundane terms. The yak is a shadowy presence in the vocabulary and in the wild, but not part of the immediate world of the king and certainly not systematically exploited. Yet, like the Shatabata Brahmana, the text alerts us to the existence of diverse networks of communication, traversing a range of social, economic, and spatial categories. I next turn to the Harsha-charita, where the Chamara acquires a very dramatic centrality. The Harsha-charita, ostensibly the biography of an early medieval king of North India, was composed by Banabhatta, Harshavardhana's court poet in the 7th century of the Common Era. While the Chamara finds mention in texts such as the Buddha-charita, which is earlier, also in the works of Kalidasa and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, some of the most prolific references come from the Harsha-charita. It is almost invariably invoked to indicate the presence of powerful gods and goddesses, kings and queens. But before we turn to these details, it may be useful to consider briefly some of the other ways in which the natural imagery is deployed in this text. And here we return to some of the ambivalences of Vedic symbolism, where the distinction between the wild and the domestic is both created and contested, and we move away from the clear-cut classifications of the Arthashastra. In the Harsha-charita, Harshavardhana and his elder brother Rajyavardhana resemble Salar trees. They also resemble the Vindhya and the Himalaya mountains respectively. More remarkably, their young companion Madhavagupta is described as someone accomplished in the hunt, so much so that the attributes of the hunted animal get incarnated in his physical appearance and his characteristics. He is doe-eyed, his nose is like that of the boar, his shoulders resemble those of the buffalo, his waist is like that of the tiger, his banner resembles that of the lion, and his gait that of the elephant. At least some of these animals figure in the list of those hunted by Harsha, which includes the lion, tiger, and wild boar. And when Harsha's parents died, and this is kind of foretold in a dream, the animals, the parents are represented by a lion and a lioness who plunge into a forest fire. And these are indications, if we need any, that there is a constant intertwining of the wild and the domesticated throughout the Sanskrit Kavya tradition. Now, returning to the Chamara, we find that no representation of devotion is complete without the Chamara being swayed ceremonially in the presence of the divinity or the king. So it is no surprise that the invocatory verses addressed to the god Shiva in the text describe him as being adorned with the Chamara. In the heavenly world, the goddess of learning Saraswati waves the Chamara for Brahma, at once her father and the presiding deity of the world. Other deities who have the benefit of being fanned by the Chamara include Kamadeva, the god of love. At another level, Rajalakshmi, the feminine embodiment of the prosperity of the realm, often visualized as a goddess, is also associated with the Chamara. And just as Saraswati sways the Chamara for Brahma, Rajalakshmi is represented as bearing it for Harsha. The Chamara Dharani, the woman bearing the Chamara, that symbolizes the presence and prosperity of the king. On the human plane, the presence of the Yak Tail fan, the Chamara, is virtually ubiquitous. In fact, the poetic imagination is prone to multiply the number of Chamaras with which the king is surrounded. To start with the court of Pushpabhuti, Harsha's famed ancestor, we learn that he was cooled by the breeze of hundreds of Chamaras. The entrance to Harsha's court likewise is distinguished amongst other things by the presence of thousands of Chamaras, used not only for human beings but for horses, elephants and camels as well. The Chamara is also part of the vivid, florid and often overwhelming descriptions of Harsha's army on the move, as well as when his army camps for the night. The representation of queens too seem to be incomplete without the mention of the Chamara. So the pregnant Yashomati, the mother of Harsha, is surrounded by Chamaras, and when she gives birth to the future kings, the wives of other kings celebrate the occasion by waving Chamaras. As important, the wives of kings who were defeated by her husband also wave Chamaras for her. Apart from routine occasions, the Chamara was also associated with rituals and rites of passage. For example, when Prabhakara Varman is supposed to decide to arrange the marriage of his daughter Rajeshri with Prahavarman, the bridegroom arrives accompanied by Chamara bearers, and there are Chamaras dangling from the ears of his elephant as well. The Chamara also figures in the scenes depicting the dying king Prabhakara Varman. Here the usually diligent Chamara bearers are listless with grief, yet Yashomati, his wife, continues to fan her dying husband with the Chamara, which is also waved when the grief-stricken Harsha reluctantly agrees to eat after having fasted for 3 days on learning about his father's illness. And when the king's funeral procession is on its way, black Chamaras are part of the equipment. All his belongings, bed, clothes, seats, vessels, umbrella, and of course the Chamara, are given to the Brahmanas after the performance of the funeral rituals. And as we can see, this list of what goes with the king during his funeral has resonances with what we were just looking at in the Arthashastra. Likewise, when Princess Rajeshri contemplates committing sati in the wilderness of the Vindhyas, she addresses amongst others her Chamara Brahmini, that is the one who has the Chamara. Waving the Chamara before another is also and obviously a marker of hierarchy. Enraged at his brother's death, Harsha declares that he will compel even the sun to wave a Chamara in his presence. He also expects all the kings from north to south to either signify their submission or confront him, and one way of signifying their submission is to wave a Chamara before him. And in situations of distress, we can see that this is symbolized by what happens to the Chamara. For example, when Harsha sets out on his campaign, even before he arrives, the Chamara drops from the hands of the serving women of his enemies. And the blast of wind blows away all the Chamaras, along with the umbrella, the other sign of royalty. The Chamara and its connotations were significant enough to provide the basis for a range of poetic analogies. So Harsha's samantas, or feudatories or subordinates, were compared to Chamaras. The tail of his famous elephant was once again like a Chamara. And in the heat of his youth, we are told that even the Chamaras of the Himalaya could not soothe either Harshavardhana or his brother. And in a lineage that is at once vivid and somewhat endearing, we are told that the flowing white beard of Simhanada, literally the lion's robe, who was the general of the erstwhile king Prabhakara, sways like a Chamara even after his master's death, as he attempts to encourage Harshavardhana to wreak revenge on the enemies of his lineage. And amongst the dozens of metaphors for vengeance used by the poets to lend weight and solemnity to this section is a reference to the Chamara. Sivananda hopes that the sides of the wives of the enemies of Harsha will replace and resemble, ironically and painfully, the breeze created by the waving of the Chamara to which they are accustomed. Interestingly, Vana offers us clues as to how the yaks and their tails may have been obtained. Towards the end of his narrative, he introduces Hamsadeka, the ambassador or messenger from the ruler of Pragyotisha, literally the light of the east, often identified with presently as Sam, who comes laden with spectacular gifts. These include the fabulous umbrella known as Afoga, several kinds of gems and spices, and both black and white chamaras, apart from a variety of birds and domesticated yaks. But, and this is more intriguing, the Chamara Yutha or herd of Chamara figure in Manabhatta's description of the Vindhya forest as well. It is true that this is an ideal idyllic forest, and perhaps that accounts for the presence of the yak as well as kinnaras. Without them, the royal narrative which culminates in the reunion of Harsha and his widowed sister Rajyashree would have been incomplete. And yet, neither Pragyotisha nor the Vindhyas can account for the proliferation of the Chamara in royal and divine imagery, and it is in this context that we are compelled to visualize complex interactions and exchanges whereby an animal of the Himalayan belt was expected to provide one of the major recurrent symbols of royalty or divinity. For Manabhatta, and he was not alone, the invocation of the Chamara was simply inevitable once royalty was mentioned. We may also note that the bearer of the Chamara was visualized as a close subordinate. This combination of proximity and subordination was more often than not embodied in the woman Chamara bearer. As we will see, this is something that changes over the next 1,000 years. Now, the next section is a kind of rapid running through of about a millennium, and I'll do that quickly. I've tentatively titled it the Yak Tail through time and space. Now, one can trace the Chamara both backwards and forwards from these representations in the Harsha Charita, and what I will be doing is simply to flag some instances, not necessarily being very comprehensive or even systematic. One of the descriptions that we have comes from Buna. He says, hairs from the tail of the yak were historically used as a tribute. White tail hairs are considered the best for this, and nowadays are sold to tourists. The major uses of tail hair are for clothing and fake beards used in Chinese opera and for wigs. The yak tail is also used as decoration and more practically as a fly whisk, well known in India but valued as such even in ancient Rome, to which it was taken by merchants from the east. Now, we can return back to the medical literature which has been surveyed by Zimmermann, who points out that in Ayurvedic texts, the Chamara is regarded as being an animal that is go-sadrisha, resembling the cow. And its meat is assigned medicinal properties. And one may suggest that perhaps this resemblance to the cow accounts for at least some of the meanings that the Chamara acquires, though it may not help us to provide the entire set of answers. Another set of references comes from famous Buddhist text, the Sammanakaya Sutta, which is part of the Buddhist canonical literature in Pali, transmitted orally for a very long time, and then written down perhaps by the turn between the first millennium BC, first millennium CE. Here we are provided with a detailed enumeration of luxuries that are to be avoided by the virtuous, which includes a whole range of different kinds of covers, beds, rugs, carpets, etc. You have reference to coverlets made out elephant, cat, and horse rugs, antelope hide rugs, deer hide rugs, etc. And then you have a list of things which are obviously regarded as articles of adornment, again to be avoided, which include powders of various kinds, oils, perfumes, water, mirrors, ointments, garlands, scents, creams, bracelets, headbands, decorated walking sticks, ornamented water bottles, swords, fancy sunshades, decorated sandals, turbans, gems, and yak tail whisks. And it goes on to long fringed robes. So the ideal monk is supposed to avoid using all of these. So we can see here that the Chamara figure is an element of adornment, symbolic of an elite lifestyle, but not confined to the king. And this suggests that the Chamara is being viewed from this tradition as something that is secular and also something that is devalued. It's not particularly significant as an emblem of fire. But at the same time, we find that there is space being created in the first millennium for the Chamara within other religious traditions. And what I will do is start from two extremes and touch on some of this gathered material simply to indicate the routes along which the Chamara may have traveled, as well as the context within which it acquires visibility. The Chamara surfaces in the visual record, although never again in the spectacular form assumed by the leader Gandhyakshi and in texts of iconography. I'll cite just 2 or 3 instances from what is obviously a prolific record. One of these is from a discussion on iconography in a Vaishnava Purana, the Vishnu Dharmottara, which is an early medieval text. Amongst other things, the text envisages that the ayudhas, or the equipment that Vishnu holds in his hands, these are also being conceptualized in anthropomorphic form. And these generically designated ayudha purushas include the gada, or the mace, which is grammatically feminine, and so is conceptualized as a woman. She, according to the text, should be represented in yellow, and she must have, and I'm quoting, she must have a slender waist and be adorned with various ornaments. She should also be made to carry a chamara in her hand. The right hand of Vishnu should be made to touch the head of Gada. There are sculptural representations. I unfortunately don't have visuals of those at the moment. But from Ellora we learn that there is a very popular image, the image of Uma Maheshwara, where the goddess and Shiva are represented. They are seated, and it includes the woman chamara bearer who is close to the goddess. And there is another scene from Ellora where you have the scene of Ravana praying to the divine couple, and there once again the goddess is attended by a woman with a chamara bearer. Now, this one, which is a small plaque, is from Bengal and dates to the 10th century. It shows a reclining goddess who is perhaps Parvati. She is again surrounded by women attendants, as you can see, doing various things. And one of them seems to hold a fan. While there is obviously a story behind this sculpture, the story has not been definitively identified. But what we can see even from this rapid survey is that by the 10th century, women bearing the chamara were part of the visual repertoire within 3 major religious strands: Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and the goddess tradition. They were not necessarily equivalent, but their existence points to the imagery being part of a taken for granted element of depictions of deities, something that we had noted in the context of the Harsha-charita. Also noteworthy is the widespread distribution of the imagery, evident from this cursory survey, surfacing in regions as far apart as Bengal and Maharashtra. The Yak Tail circulated well beyond the subcontinent also. Apart from the citation from Zuna that I just mentioned, we find that there has been a more detailed study done recently by Valerie Hanston in 2009, where she draws attention to the way in which you can see links between Khotan, the Dunhuang caves, and the Chamara surfacing along the Silk Route. She says that horses and jade were amongst the most common tribute items from Khotan, and other recorded gifts included camels, falcons, yak tail, textile, fur, medicine, minerals, herbs, some types of fragrances, amber, and coral. And one can see that there are resonances with the list in the Arthashastra, But in this context, we do not have a discussion on the use of the Yak Tail. There is another particularly intriguing document that she cites, which contains a list of what was carried as tribute and what was received in return. The tribute was carried by a group of 29 people, and it included a ball of jade, a yak tail, an antelope horn, and a letter. And in return, these people received considerable quantities of cloth, silver vessels, and other articles. While Hansel alerts us to the fact that we do not know the size of the ball of jade or its quality, there was no obvious equivalence in the transaction. And clearly the single yak tail and the antelope horn were part of a symbolic exchange. Now, the trails through Central Asia return us back to the subcontinent in a variety of ways. And again, in an exercise that is obviously selective, we can turn to Agni Fazl's late 16th century text, the Aini Akbari. Amongst other things, this encyclopedic work contains a list of various ensigns of royalty. These include the order or the throne, the chhat or the umbrella, the sayahan, which seems to be used to keep out the rays of the sun, and the kaukaba, which is annotated by Blockman as plates, which were meant to be hung in the assembly hall. All of these were meant for the king only. But we have the list of another set of artifacts which include the alam or the standard. And when the king writes out, we are told that not less than 5 of these are carried along with the code, allocated as a collection of flags, arms, and other insignia which follow the king wherever he goes. And these include the chatrok, which seems to be, which is again adorned with the tails of the Tibetan yak. And there's another of these, the sumantok, which is supposed to be like the chatrok but longer. And both of these are regarded as flags of the highest dignity, bestowed only on the great nobles. So once again, it's not meant only for the king, but for an exclusive category. There is also mention of the jhanda or the Indian flag in that context. So we can see that the yak tail now retains a place as a status symbol in a very different context and is part of a very distinct assemblage. There are other contexts in which the text mentions the yak. These include the detailed accounts that you have of the 12 subas, which is part of the text. And in the description of ours, we learn that from the northern mountains, quantities of goods are carried on the backs of men, of stout ponies, and of goats. And the goods listed include gold, copper, lead, musk, tails of the kutas cow, which is once again annotated as the yak, honey, chuk, which is some kind of a combination of orange juice and lemon, pomegranate seeds, ginger, long pepper, magic root, borax, wax, wooden stuff, woodenware, it goes on. Now, if the early description of the yak tail as part of the royal insignia resonates with the Harsha character, then this list seems to echo the concerns of the Arthashastra. What is also interesting is the way in which the yak is located within a detailed and descriptive account of wild animals, which includes the banmanus, possibly an ape-like creature, elephants, lions, leopards, panthers, tigers, bears, wolves and dogs of various breeds, monkeys, lynxes, hyenas, jackals, foxes, otters, cats, the shardul. Then we have the rhinoceros, the black antelope, the deer, and then we have the yak, which we are told approximates to the domestic cow, but of its tail is made the kutas or fringed tassel, and many of these they join together. Text goes on to describe varieties of birds. There is another Mughal artifact that is interesting, and this is a visual from the Rasamnama, the Persian translation of the Mahabharata prepared at the Mughal court. One of the illustrations from the manuscript depicts Ganesha, traditionally recognized as the first scribe of the text, with 2 women on either side waving fans. Again, this has resonances with an image that occurs in the Lalita Sahasranama, a text in praise of the goddess, where one of the names of the goddess is Satyamara Rama Vani Savya Dakshina Sevita. She who is served by Lakshmi and Saraswati placed to her left and right respectively, both bearing chamaras. These images reiterate the motif of the woman bearer of the chamara. And yet, somewhere by the 18th and the 19th centuries, there is a change in representational strategies. And I will just trace this using visual materials from northwest India. From the 18th century, if not earlier, representations of the chamara figure in paintings from Punjab and adjoining regions. These are deployed in both religious and secular contexts and in situations where there is an overlap between the two. We find, for instance, a representation of Guru Nanak with a Raja. This is dated to 1733, where the latter is accompanied by a male chamara bearer. And in another picture, which is dated to 1830, Guru Nanak is accompanied by a male chamara bearer. And a few years later, we have this visual, which is of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in his darbar, who is again accompanied by a male chamara bearer. And the very next year, 1839, we have a representation of the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, where he is surrounded within the enclosure by mourning women. But the chamara bearer who just stands outside the enclosure is a man. And in a sense, this culminates in a scene that we find fairly often, which is of the Guru Granth Sahib itself being worshipped by waving a chamara around it. Now, what is noteworthy is that while the chamara remains in place, the bearer is no longer a woman. The chamara has changed hands, and one is how it remains questions to which I do not have immediate answers. Given that royalty is now officially extinct, the chamara is no longer part of overtly political symbolism. Yet it forms part of the ritual equipment used in a variety of Hindu traditions. It is most commonly used as a part of a set of equipment with which arati is performed, worshipping the deity with lamps, some lit with camphor, with the conch shell, occasionally filled with water, with cloth, and with the chamara. A list from a website selling equipment for devotees of Krishna groups the chamara along with incense, tulsi, a CD about Krishna's victory over his wicked uncle comes, and a sodas or something like that. But anyway, so you have all of this equipment put in place. And in some more philosophical speculations, we are told that these elements with which the arati is performed represent elements like light, fire, sound, water, air, etc. Now, these are just quotes from the Krishna Store website, where it tells you that you can buy an excellent quality chamara if you want an original one. These are in short supply and extremely difficult to get, but these are the ones with which the gopis worshipped Krishna and Mother Yashoda also. And because they have limited stock, you will have to order right now. And of course, they assure us that these will all vary slightly in size and shape because they are produced. We should remember that they are produced by the yaks and not in a factory. Obviously, the poor yaks are not producing chamaras, but nonetheless. And of course, they may be slightly off-white as this is a natural product. Okay. Now, but it also, the chamara is there at the other end in Mongolia. This is a visual from the National Games, the opening ceremony or the closing ceremony, I forget which of the National Games that held in Mongolia in 2008, where once again you can see these horsemen carrying chamaras. So it's almost like a Mughal symbol being recreated out there. So you can see that there is a whole range of contexts within which the chamara is still being used in the 21st century. Now, this is the penultimate section where I try to come back to the first bearer of the tale, that is the yak. Now, ethnographies of yak pastoralists and accounts of their practices as well as the life cycle of the animals take us into a different realm altogether. And the two works that I've used as entry points, one is by Vincent Tharkial and the other is by Kenneth Bauer. Both of these are 20th, in fact they were both published in the last decade, but they draw on 20th century ethnographies. The first one centered on Tibet, but reconstructing practices from the memories of migrant populations, and the other based on the experiences of a population that straddles the border between Nepal and Tibet. So there is obviously a trap of timelessness into which it is easy to slip, and we need to remind ourselves about what these ethnographies can tell us and what they cannot tell us. We also have FAO studies on yak husbandry, which state, and this was a study done, published in 2006, done in the early part of this millennium, which says that at present there are 14 million domesticated yaks, of which the vast majority, 13 million, are at present in China. This is a rough map of the distribution pattern, and you can see that there are large areas of Tibet and elsewhere where the yak is present. The yak population, the white yak population is steadily dwindling as we might expect, and now stands at around 15,000. There is a general consensus that the yak is identified as both Ghanaian, and it gets the second half of the name that it belongs to the cattle family, and it gets the name Ghanaians because it apparently grunts rather than moves. The only one who or the scholar who seems to disagree is Olson, who suggests that it is more bison-like, and he would then call it the Poifagus Ghanaians, but obviously grunting is common. And the yak, we are told, was domesticated in Tibet, perhaps by the first millennium BC. Now, it's evident that yaks are part of complex intersecting worlds of peasant traders, pastoralists, and monastic populations. In fact, as Bauer observes, the combination of agriculture, animal husbandry, and trade is best visualized as a triangulated production system, one that extends beyond any neatly delimited territorial unit. Also typical of nomadic pastoralists, their survival depends on their ability to tap diverse resources and landscapes, varying according to the seasons. In other words, mobility is inbuilt into the pastoral lifestyle. That's a domesticated yak index. Within these words, yaks are valuable for a variety of reasons. For the farmer, they provide manure and dung, fuel, which is also valued by others. They serve as excellent pack animals for traders, pastoralists at high altitudes, use these for purposes of transport, and they constituted part of the resources of wealthy monastic establishments. And you do have crossbred yaks with cattle, which are used commonly for ploughing. There are several terms used to designate the yak. In fact, yak in Tibetan is used for the male animal, while the female is referred to as tree. And the latter tends to have less bushy tails, and they're classified depending on whether they are calving, whether they are barren, and whether they have yearling calves. And they usually continue to be fertile for 6 to 8 seasons. The domesticated male has a lifespan of about 20 years, the female between 15 to 20 years. The animals mature by about 4 to 5 years and have a reproductive span of a maximum of 10 years. And as I mentioned earlier, they are extremely valuable because of the heavy loads that they can carry and the fact that they can traverse extremely difficult terrain at heights of up to 20,000 feet. Yak milk is processed into butter, curd, and cheese. And yaks have both hair as well as wool. The hair tends to be on the shoulder and the upper part, while the lower part tends to be more fleecy. Shearing is done in summer and definitely usually requires several people to hold the animal down. And Student Hemendorf has a little description about how apart from shearing and plucking of the wool, every 2 or 3 years the hair of the yak tail can also be cut. And this tail is an interesting difference from what very often happens with other animals which have their tails cut, where it's docking, where the tail is kind of severed from the body. This seems to be a different procedure. The hair was often worked into ropes and baskets, and yak skin bags were valued as containers. The FAO study notes that skins could be used to make a range of produce from coats for children to tents and blankets and bowls. At present, butchering yaks is definitely perceived as a necessary evil, ideally to be performed by someone else if one can afford it. The number of animals that is slaughtered is generally not large. A poor family would probably slaughter one animal a year, others might slaughter 4 to 5. And slaughtering is usually done in autumn when the animal is fattened on the summer pastures. And generally the animal is portioned in terms of its legs, head, hide and tail. You do also have ritual slaughter of the yak to celebrate the harvest. Sometimes they are also gifted to monasteries as part of the funeral ritual. And again, the yak figures in a complex symbolism of death and triumphing over it, where yaks represent both Yama and Yamantaka, that is the figure that does away with Yama. The FAO study cited earlier mentions in passing that some parts of the yak have symbolic value. These include the head and the tail. It states that the hair from the yak's tail is used ceremonially and as a fly whisk. Yak heads and tails are also made into ornaments and given as gifts. It also records that in most yak raising areas, the head of the yak is thought to be a symbol of strength and safety, and the yak tail a symbol of wealth and luck. Therefore, yak heads and tails, with or without hair and hide on them, are made into ornaments by herdsmen or given as gifts to guests as gifts. And the tail can vary from 60 to 100 centimeters. Bauer notes that prior to the establishment of entrenched frontiers, there was a brisk trade in yak tails. And he says, used as ritual fans in Hindu temples in India and for St. Nicholas beards in Europe. There were other uses of yak head and tail as well, and also notes some of these. He says that yak hair from tails and the long body covering of the animals has considerable importance in the monasteries of Tibet. At one monastery, there are huge draperies or screens made from woven black and brown yak hair that hang down from the second floor balcony to the ground in the inner courtyard, and multiple strands of yak hair hang from the tops of prayer flagpoles in front of many Buddhist temples. He also says that he observed monks using yak hair dusters attached to long bowls to clean the deities. Now, prior to the 21st century, we can see that yak tails were exchanged for trade, wool, and salt as well as grain. And in these contexts, traders from all over Asia would probably have assembled in markets in Tibet. These are the way the yak tail looks. And this is the yak on a 5 rupee currency note in Nepal, giving us an idea about its significance at present. I just come to the concluding section, where what to suggest is that the trails of the yak go in many directions. It has acquired and shared ritual meanings through the millennia. Gods and goddesses who have been worshipped using it have waxed and waned in importance. And yet the yak tail has demonstrated a certain resilience as a symbol. It is because, as one of the Yakophiles observes, bulky, black and shinily clad, yaks convey a rugged elegance. They belong to bitter storms and barren uplands. It is also significant that although clearly non-Vedic, the chamara emerges as one of the most visible and persistent symbols of royalty, possibly from the Mauryas to the Mughals and beyond, and seems to have survived the dismantling of monarchy. What is also noteworthy is the space within which the yak is located in taxonomies such as those found in the Arthashastra and the Ain, in a liminal zone verging on the wild. Does this account for the meanings that it acquires, and why is the bearer of the chamara more or less consistently female for centuries? What does this tell us about meanings of ritual and political spaces? We also need to consider that yak tails do not naturally become chamaras. That requires fitting on a handle more or less refined, made of wood or metal. It also requires transporting the tail of the chamaras through vast stretches of difficult terrain. In other words, the intervention of a host of nearly invisible intermediaries before we arrive at the article advertised on the website. When I tried to purchase one at the local market, the product was a miniature chamara with a little wooden handle for which I had to pay about 40 rupees. When I asked about more impressive ones that are part of temple rituals, I was told that these come from Kolkata, take about 2 to 3 weeks to arrive, and will cost about 700 or 800 rupees. Now, one of the trajectories we can trace is of the insertion of the chamara into diverse rituals and religious contexts. It also seems to have been part of more secular luxuries, as the Pali Buddhist tradition indicates. Then again, it surfaces as a consistent and constant image of royalty, both within the circumscribed space of the court and in more open and uncertain space of the battlefield. What about the bearer of the chamara? She or he could have been seen as a person whose presence lent a distinct aura to the person whom she or he accompanied. At the same time, her or his position was one of subordination, whether as an attendant on royalty or on divinity. When we turn to the masculinization of the chamara bearer, can we suggest that it has to do with the shrinking space of its use, especially with the apparent disappearance of royalty? In the ritual context where the chamara continues to be used, it seems to be a predominantly male preserve, at least in the public domain. Is it because the chamara bearer is now perceived more as someone who mediates between the devotee and the deity, even as he remains subordinate to the latter? So basically what I'm trying to suggest is that exploring these possibilities allows us to move beyond, to visualize the worlds of the elite as being less sharply delimited than we often think them to be, and as worlds that interpenetrate with those of others who are barely visible, but nonetheless almost omnipresent, without whom notions of ritual and royalty do not acquire their meaning. And I'll just end by citing something that Finlay Flood mentions in a different context, where he suggests that the outcomes of encounters between Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim elites in eastern Iran and western India were determined not by incommensurable essences, but by historical agents responding to aesthetic, cultural, economic, and political concerns. Once we open ourselves to these possibilities, we have an opportunity to understand trails and tales in more meaningful ways. Thank you.